12A is an ordinance making and fixing the annual appropriations for the several departments, agencies, and funds of the City of Knoxville for the fiscal period beginning July 1, 2023 and ending June 30, 2024, and providing the authority to reappropriate non-project related encumbrances at the end of fiscal year 2022-2023 into fiscal year 2023-2024.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion made to approve and seconded. Council members, there's two members of the public who have signed up to speak on this item. First is Moira Connolly. If you could state your name and address for the record, and then you'll have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Moira Connolly. I live at 5726 South Briscoe Circle. I'm a constituent of Councilmember Thomas. I'm here today representing a group of people that you all have heard from before, who've been advocating for almost 3 years for an alternative response team in the city of Knoxville. As you may recall, an alternative response team pairs a nurse or medic with a behavioral health professional to respond to mental health and nonviolent incidents in the community. Knoxville deserves a commitment to creating an alternative response team, but that commitment is not currently reflected in the proposed budget. We think it should be. Alternative response teams are used across the country: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Austin, Eugene, Oregon, Chicago, Denver, and most recently San Rafael, California. In fact, many mental health professionals consider an alternative response team as a best practice. Interestingly, other local professionals also consider alternative response teams to be a best practice. Recently, the University of Tennessee Law School held a public panel discussion on alternatives to policing. The panelists included Chief Noel, Ms. Middlebrook, a UT professor on sociology, and our community member, Ms. Mfame, who works with Community Defense of East Tennessee. When all those panelists were asked about the number one thing that could be done to improve public safety, an alternative response team was affirmed by all 4 members of the panel as essentially the number one thing outside of the police force that could be done to improve public safety in any community. And those 4 panelists had a very divergent point of view on many other questions that were asked. But when they were asked about the single thing that they would recommend to any community, the consensus among all 4 of them was an alternative response team. In May of 2021, almost exactly 2 years ago, I spoke to City Council on this topic. As I say, we've been working on this for almost 3 years. At that time, I asked this question: will it take a tragedy before we realize that Knoxville needs an alternative response team? Unfortunately and horribly, that tragedy has occurred. In that incident, video showed police responding to a situation at a hospital that did not need a police response. The city had no other way for anyone to respond to that situation because we do not have an alternative response team. I want to acknowledge that our group has had conversations with city officials about alternative response for almost 3 years. At the end of all those conversations, the takeaway that we understood was that we, a group of community volunteers, should go figure out how to do alternative response in Knoxville and come back to the city when we got it all figured out. That's not collaboration, and it's certainly not leadership. This year's budget proposes a reorganization of the Office of Empowerment and the Office of Public Safety. As that reorganization progresses, we believe that the new entity should be tasked with finding a way to facilitate an alternative response program for Knoxville. That may mean helping to create a community-based nonprofit to run the program, or creating a program within the city structure. Both models are used across the country. Even as, tonight, City Council is being asked to approve funding requests to federal agencies, such as the U.S. Justice Department and the Housing and Urban Development, for worthwhile violence prevention programs, City Council has never been asked to approve such funding requests for an alternative response team. That money has been there. It's been sitting there in the federal government and the city has never asked for it because we've never looked for it. The city administration needs to make a public commitment to create an alternative response team. Specifically, we ask that City Council refrain from approving this budget unless part of the mandate of any reorganization of public safety offices includes a mandate to facilitate the creation of an alternative response team. The city's public safety infrastructure deserves evidence-based best practices, and the consensus is that an alternative response team meets that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person who signed up to speak on item 12A is Rick Roach. Mr. Roach, if you'd please come to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and you'll have up to 5 minutes to address council.
Rick Roach, Knoxville. This budget process, we've had 3 years of it. We've watched things get pushed through. Same old, same old. We don't have any way for the citizens of Knoxville, for the people of Knoxville, to have direct input into this process and to actually state what the real priorities should be. We've been through this over and over and over again. So we have people right now, right up the block, who are suffering. It's not hard to see. It's not hard to tell what's going on, but we've been doing this whole process of same old, same old. And if we haven't figured out that it's not working, then that means that a change needs to be made in how we. Bottom line is, the budget is a moral statement. It's about what you actually believe is important and who is important. I was raised to respond to what a need was, what people's needs were. So when you see people in need and you see people in pain, you figure out how to alleviate that situation as best you can with the resources that you have. And the city of Knoxville has not done that. At least it feels like there's nothing really happening here that will say, okay, we've got this opportunity to take care of this, to take care of people out on the street, to make sure we have affordable housing. The resources are there. So the question is, are the priorities there? Do you all actually believe it's a priority? If you don't, say it. Baseball stadium, that was a priority. Okay? Bottom line. And we've gone through multiple scenarios now where the characterization of getting all that in that area, I mean, we've had misrepresentation of the history behind it, what's actually happened, the people who have been negatively affected and are still being negatively affected. That type of thing we can't continue to have. I know you guys lay your plans out. When I say you guys, you all come in and fill in a position, and there you go. You keep pushing the plan. Whatever the plan was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you guys are just pieces to put in and carry out the plan. And the only person that's going to benefit are those who already have. That's the bottom line. And we've got to break this cycle. If we don't, you're going to have just a group of haves and a group of have-nots. In fact, I think we're already there. So I don't know what else to tell you to do except search your souls. I said to you, Mayor, several years ago, city council meeting, I watched you act up. It was a Zoom meeting. You acted up. You were rude to Councilwoman Parker, outright rude. And I spoke to you guys. I said, you know, you need to have a change of heart, a change of mind. Otherwise, you know, there's going to be a situation. I got 35 seconds. You, Chief, you gotta wake up. And I'm saying that respectfully, okay? Knoxville's not New Orleans. Man, I'm frustrated, and a lot of people are frustrated. Y'all need to know this. Y'all really need to know this. A lot of people are frustrated, and we don't know what else to do and say to you. We don't know, okay? We can't get the truth from you, you know. We asked for transparency. You said you were going to give us transparency, and what did you give us in the search process? Nothing. So that's it. My time's up.
Thank you. Council members, that concludes people who signed up to speak on this item of the agenda. I wanted to first thank all of you for attending the State of the City last week, where I gave the broad highlights of the budget proposal that's before you this evening. As Vice Mayor Roberto mentioned at the top of the meeting, we're ready to have a full hearing. The legislative hearings are scheduled for all day next Tuesday, and so we will be ready to take any and all questions at that time. Also, my deputies, Aaron Gill and David Brace, have reached out to each of you by email to invite you to set up meetings to go in detail with them either before Tuesday or after Tuesday before the second reading of this item. So I just wanted to thank you for attending the State of the City and participating in that. Also, Ms. Gill, if you could just take a minute to sort of, the alternative response is an issue that has come up. That's something that we have worked to try to address and consider. So if you could just speak to the process we've followed so far on that.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Aaron Gill, Deputy to Mayor Kincannon. And yes, I think, Council, you've actually had a workshop on this, if you recall, back in June of 2021. And the action step that the city staff recommended at that time in partnership with McNabb, who of course is the core staff support for our co-responder program, was to fund and complete the sequential intercept mapping process, which informs where there are gaps in the existing system and what resources exist. And so that process was completed last year, and alternative response, while it was considered one of the considerations of that workshop very specifically, it did not emerge as one of the top recommendations. In light of that, as well as some of the ongoing priorities that we have related to standing up the new violence interruption program and knowing funding constraints as well, this budget does not include funding for alternative response, but it does include the continued funding for, of course, community safety initiatives, including Turn Up Knox, and continued discussion and the ability to continue to explore the types of programs that can not only serve the community, but also help the police department focus on core law enforcement actions that they need to prioritize.
Thank you. Council Member Parker.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a question, but I'm also needing to respond to what was just shared, and I'm not prepared enough to respond to it, but I remember that conversation and about the sequential intercept mapping. And essentially that's, how to ensure those in our community struggling with mental health are not coming into contact with the justice system unnecessarily. And so I remember at the time arguing that the best way to ensure that is an alternative response model that doesn't use police in the response. So I'm still confused, and I would love to get the city's report or analysis that came out of that sequential intercept mapping process, because how it does not lead us to alternative response when the point of it is supposed to be to keep folks with mental health challenges out of the criminal justice system when there is no need, when they have not committed a criminal act but are simply, we're just relying on a criminal justice system because we don't have other tools. So I continue to support alternative response, and I hope that we as a city will actually do our due diligence around this, and put some thoughtful consideration into what this could do for our city, because I think it's desperately needed. In terms of the budget, one question I had was looking at the, looking through it, and you know, I compare it to older budgets because that's what helps me see things. I did not see reserves budgeted in here, so I wanted to ask, where do we find our reserves in this budget?
Mr. Evans?
The proposed budget is a balanced budget, and there is no unassigned fund balance that needs to be appropriated for it. That's why you don't see any mention of it.
Wait, what? There's no unassigned fund balance?
No, we are not proposing the appropriation of any unassigned fund balance dollars
For reserves.
for.
In other words, we're not
to
dipping into our
balance this
reserves. We're not dipping into our reserves to cover our operating budget
But-
or capital.
But to budget a certain percentage of our budget to serve as our reserves and to have a balanced budget, would it not need to show up in the budget? Or are we not
No, ma'am.
budgeting for reserves?
I'm thinking you may be thinking of the annual comprehensive financial report, where we do lay out fund balance, the 5 different categories and what's in them. What we do in what we do in the proposed budget is we talk about the sources of revenue in full and the expenditures that are going to be made are being proposed in full,
So
and
let-
those have to balance out.
So let me ask this. So our reserves are simply sitting in our unassigned fund balance, and we don't include that like a 1.5% of our expenditures by policy.
We are required by charter to set back between 1% and 5% of the general fund as a reserve. That was something put in many, many years ago. And
Right.
we always put 1% aside in the budget for that. But that is, it's there.
In unassigned?
Actually, that would be committed. That would be in a category called committed, because the legislative body at one time approved of that, so it would have to be in what's called committed fund balance.
So either it's in unassigned fund balance, or it should show up here for us to be able to
Actually,
commit that money.
there's 5 categories of unassigned fund balance. You got non-spendable, okay, which you can't touch. You got restricted, which somebody's put restriction on you, like by a grantor or something. You've got committed, which means it's gone before this legislative body. At some point, you put some rules in place so that that goes into there. For instance, not only that 1%, but 20% of the general fund goes into what's called a stabilization account. That's in committed fund balance because that was approved by the legislative body. Then you have what's called assigned, which are by practices put into that category. And then you have unassigned fund balance, which it's essentially, it's available for use. Now, when we are projecting right now, ending this FY that we're currently in, at right around 29 million in unassigned fund balance. But we're not having to use any of it in this budget that's proposed before you.
Ms.
So if you
Parker,
don't mind, just
you-
for-
your 5 minutes are up. You can come back. We'll go to your other council members.
It's just to clarify, because I want this to not just be for me, but for the public to better understand our processes, right? So if we have a policy that says we need to budget 1%, put aside 1% of our budget, I want to be able, we can identify that and clarify that it's not in our budget, but it's in our funds under unassigned or assigned fund balance. But can we just clarify that piece?
I think Mr. Evans just did, so we'll go to Mr. Smith, and if there's further clarity that he can provide, we will do so. Mr. Smith?
I had a lot of the same questions today, so I spent a half an hour trying to get clear on it. I think I'm there. The second part of this ordinance is providing the authority to reappropriate non-project related encumbrances at the end of this FY into the next FY.
That is correct.
And that's a new part of this.
That is something we've started doing the last proposed budget for the fiscal year that we're in now, FY '23, and it's in this proposed budget for the upcoming FY '24. We've put that language in there toward it's in the back of not the back of, but it's after the numbers in the ordinance that you've got, the proposed budget ordinance, which gives us the authority to move monies around at the end of the fiscal year to balance out the various funds. For instance, if we fell short in, I don't know, special events, that office could very well happen. But we had some extra in, I'll say Tom, their engineering department, not in the capital stuff, but in their operating. Maybe we could move it over there, because you got to balance your budget per state law. And, you know, one thing about the departments and funds, tell you almost anything you want to know, but one thing I can tell you for sure is none of them are going to be exactly where you thought they were at the time you set forth the proposed budget. You're going to be over on some, you're going to have less on some others. So you've got to balance that. And that's that part of this ordinance. I think it's paragraph 6, I think it is, gives us that authority, sir.
And so if we have surplus and revenues, well, let me back, just to replay that back to you. At the end of this FY, between now and the end of the year, this is granting you authority to level load all of those to reflect all of the departmental budgets the way they originally budgeted. Is that fair?
Affirmative.
Okay. And now I forgot my second question.
I think you were talking about what's going to happen if, let's say there's excess.
Yeah, it rains $5
revenues
million more
over
dollars than we
expenditures.
expected.
Then those automatically go into fund balance.
Unassigned.
Unassigned fund balance as it pertains to the general fund.
And we can only tap into those dollars if this body approves
That's
a
correct.
budget
Yeah,
amendment or some.
we can't just spend them.
That's right.
We have to come back to you.
So if revenues are more than we projected, that goes into our savings. And if we want to use those, this body will approve those.
Affirmative,
Okay,
yes, sir.
all right, thank you. I had one more question about the alternative response. I do think, I would like to discuss that more in our legislative meeting. So I echo Councilwoman Parker's comments around data, specifically as it relates to the co-responder model to date. I remember, or at least maybe I read myself into the play, but I remember us discussing all of the options, voting to proceed with this option, but leaving the door open for the ability to be nimble and pivot more in a non-co-responder, alternative response only model. So that data, I think, would be very welcome to me. Not to belabor the point now, but Turn Up Knox does violence interruption now. Did they respond without a police officer?
Turn Up Knox does not respond to 911 calls. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ms. Middlebrook?
Violence interruption and alternative response are two different models, and so when they engage, they are not engaging with police officers, but it is not the same thing as alternative response. It's designed to do some very different things.
Two different things, but Turn Up Knox does respond without police officers. Correct. Okay, thank you.
And I would just add that Turn Up Knox did not exist a few years ago, and the city and Ms. Middlebrook in particular has helped them establish themselves and create a nonprofit from scratch. And Seed has been really helpful in that. And that's just takes a tremendous amount of work and capacity building. So it's not that you can just flip a switch and say, let's do this. It takes a lot of training because we want to do it right. And similar with alternative response, to my knowledge, there's no existing entity in the city of Knoxville or in the nearby area who is ready, willing, and able to do the work similar to what we've heard about in other cities. So standing that up is something that could conceivably be done, but it's not like easy, and it's not something that we've prioritized the violence interruption has been a higher priority.
Yeah, I'll just end by saying, I think they're both similar in the sense that we're trying something new, and we need, just my opinion is that we need to remain nimble enough to adapt to what we learn from the data and not feel restricted to whatever that is. The same way we weren't restricted to what we did before, we should remain nimble and use data to change. So, thanks.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Roberto.
Thank you, Mayor. Director Evans, since we're talking with you right now, obviously council's going to have our legislative budget hearings on May 9th, so we'll get into more detail here, but just in general, how would you characterize the financial health of the city in this budget?
Just off the top of my head, I'd have to say financially sound. By that, I mean, yes, we're dealing with higher inflationary costs, but we've got sufficient unassigned fund balance and a total fund balance to deal with any unforeseen circumstances. And we didn't have to use any unassigned fund balance to propose a balanced budget. So no, we don't have money falling all over the place, but we're in a financially sound position.
Okay, thank you. And then, just to the extent you can you talk to us a little bit about maybe like broad strokes about forecasting, projections, things that you're looking at in the future, maybe in particular with trends you're seeing from the revenue side, things like that? Can you give us a little bit of a general look ahead?
Well, there's about 4 or 5 things that we really got into as we were forecasting this that were key. One of them is inflation. I mean, that's no surprise to anybody here. Virtually all goods and services have gone up. Rising personnel costs, pay and benefits, those go up every year. We also looked at the increase in pension unfunded liability that we have to pay, $2.35 million extra this coming FY. Got less grant money, about $41 million less, almost exactly, than we did last FY. And if you look at our proposed capital budget, you'll see that it's less by about that exact amount because we don't have that. On kind of the positive side, or not kind of, it is positive. We do have increased property tax revenue from where this body, approved a tax increase of 36.5 cents. And we've got increased sales tax revenue. I had written down here right around 16.4 million more projected if you combine local option and state shared sales tax, if you go from this current FY into what we're thinking it's going to be in the proposed budget for '24. So those were the key things that we had to forecast. I mean, we forecast everything. You do a budget. Those were primary drivers, sir.
Okay. And you mentioned this, I think, in some answers to some earlier questions, but with regard to the Economic Stabilization Fund, you've got that funded with the 20% that goes in, by council resolution, but then also the 5% best practice.
That's correct. 20% in stabilization sound committed. The 5% goes into assigned as best practices. And we don't touch that. That's not proposed in here.
Okay. Thank you. And then, Mr. Frost, I wanted to turn real quickly to you. You had sent an email to council members just reminding us of the direction the charter gives us as to first reading. Just for, the folks at home, can you just go over that real quickly with us? What is council to do per the charter with regard to first reading?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Section 901E is an echo of the charter. First sentence, the council shall pass the budget ordinance on first reading, and thereafter, the council shall hold public hearings on the proposed operating budget, as well as the capital improvements budget, so on and so forth. But the gist is council is compelled by the charter to pass the budget on first reading.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember McKenzie?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to just go back to the alternative response conversation. I know that we have not, to my knowledge, had an update on the co-responder unit as far as their data. In the last probably 8 to 9 months. I think it would be good for us to be able to get an update on how that unit is going, the number of calls, those types of things. And then also just the cost
Okay.
for us to be able to run that unit and their hours of operation. So we can take a more closer look at that versus alternative response, knowing that, as Councilmember Smith and Parker alluded, understanding that we should keep all options open as we look at mental health crisis, those types of things that are increasing.
Right.
And the types of calls that we're receiving. And so I think that would be good for council members to have that information to kind of level set in the conversations going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'll work with Chief Noel to see how fast we can gather that information for you. I think it's also important, as you all know, since you've been working on mental health issues, like, the city can't do this alone. We need to work with our county and state officials, since it's actually under their purview to provide for the public health, including mental health. We shouldn't let them off the hook of that obligation. Councilmember Singh. Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember McKenzie, did you have more? Sorry.
One more thing, I'd also like to know if we can get the number of calls where police have had to accompany mobile crisis unit on calls, if that's available, versus the co-responder unit.
Yeah, I think the mobile crisis unit is a little bit of a misnomer.
Is it
I don't know. We'll look into it, but my understanding is like they don't go with police barely at all, and it's not really, instant like a 911 call. It's like, but we'll confirm that. That's my understanding from last time we asked, and but I'll work with Chief Noel and Chief Sharp to gather that information for council.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Singh.
Thank you, Mayor. As you know, I'm a big supporter of the alternative response team. What I am curious about is, this question's for Ms. LaKenya and Chief Noel. You guys were on a panel, and from what Ms. Connolly said, you were both very much in support of a model like this. Can you just comment on what you think might be a good way for us to move forward?
Ms. Middlebrook.
Yes, and I did participate in that panel, and I believe what I said on that panel is that I am open to exploring how we may be able to engage something like alternative response in the future. I do see value in the work. I also recognize that we have limited capacity in our city, and as we look at models, a lot of times, and part of, I think, where some of the delay has come from, and these are conversations that we have had with HART, is there was some misunderstanding on each end, I believe, as to how the work was going forward. I thought that we had come to some more understanding about that, and we're looking to move forward, and I'm eager to continue those conversations about how we can potentially move forward in engaging similar work as we explore what our options are. At this point, we have, as Mayor Kincannon said, prioritized violence reduction as we have seen significant increases in violence in our community and have put our resources there. As Ms. Gill stated, in the participation in the sequential intercept mapping process with service providers who are engaging in this work at various levels. There was a lot of interest expressed in continuing to explore how to build out and better resource the co-responder model. And so we have been listening to service providers in the community around how to better engage. But I am, as everyone here has said, open to exploring all options and keeping all options on the table as we look at how to best serve our community.
So thank you for that. I think this isn't an exact overlap with violence prevention. To me, what this model works on is our mental health issues, and as we've been using the police as social workers to make house calls, I think it would actually help the police department for us to have that. But Chief Noel, I'd love to hear your opinions on it.
Well, as I said in the panel, I really think working with the violence interrupters and Turn Up Knox has been very beneficial to us. I believe in the co-responder program. I'm absolutely committed to that. I'm committed to programs like law enforcement diversion. The other side of things, just the reality of it is that, police and fire respond to a very high volume of calls for service. And any model that comes out of that is going to require, you know, a lot of staffing. So I'm not, just like Director Middlebrook, I'm not opposed to anything. I'm open to working with anything. But the reality of it is that we do respond to a high volume of calls, not only police, but the fire department as well.
May I ask Ms. Connolly a question, if you're still here? Hi, I know we talked about this a couple years ago,
Sure.
but please refresh my memory.
Yeah.
The models that you looked at, were those models run by the police departments, the city, or nonprofits that were separate entities?
There's some of everything. And what we would be looking to do is engage with the city, because as Chief Noel is alluding to, in most models, the calls run through 911. So the city has to be involved. This is not something that can be done outside the structure of the city. So it has to involve, you know, the partnership with the city. So we would welcome that opportunity, and we feel like we've not been as well received as we would like, but we look forward to working in partnership.
Have you had a chance to have a conversation with Knox County, because 911 covers both?
We talked to fire department. Is that both Knox County and, no, it's just the city. We've talked, no.
Okay,
We've
so
not.
that's something that we should probably do.
If someone's that brave, yes.
Thank you for that information. And thank you for bringing this topic up. I just jumped on the bandwagon of this because we don't have this conversation often enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Mayor. I also had concerns about